Um, the way I guess introductions are meant to make the speaker even more intimidated by by the setting, and that was successful. So thank you very much for having me here. It is an honor and a privilege to be speaking to this audience, and in the anniversary of a great institution that I have sort of had many different kinds of wonderful and invigorating connections with. And congratulations to IGIER for turning 20. You're young, you have a way to go. And now that everybody's going to live till 150 or whatever, you have really a long way to go. And you have no doubt you will. So this is about the engine of growth. This session is supposed to be about engines of growth, and I kind of thought about what I would talk about, and there were several options, but in the end I thought I would talk about the literature which I think has now accumulated enough, I think, knowledge at some level that you could at least say that there are well-defined puzzles. Many other literatures haven't quite got to that point where the puzzles are well-defined. You don't know whether it's ignorance that defines the puzzles or real puzzles. And I think here there is at least a sense in which there are real puzzles, I think, and maybe also real ideas and to think about the puzzle. So what I'll try to do is I'll try to lay out a kind of a landscape and then suggest one idea of how to think about the landscape as sort of one kind of quote-unquote theory. There will be no equations. Indeed, the theory is so elementary that it wouldn't deserve much more than what I will do, but it nonetheless has some ability to explain the data. So I don't have to thanks to Wolfgang, I don't have to justify that education is an engine of growth. That was a claim he already made, and I'll hide behind him. Now, what's true about education? Well, first thing that's true about education is the very good news, which is that school participation has been growing extraordinarily fast. Here's a picture of what has happened, and you can see that basically even in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, which were the laggards, starting in about 2000, you see this kink in these curves, and the curves are really moving up. School participation is growing very, very fast. Indeed, I think very soon, if you look at the people who are in the cohort, 6 to 12 in South Asia, it's well over 90%. School participation is well over 90%. So people are in school. That should have been a cause for celebration, but in some sense, with that has come out a bunch of data on learning levels. And the data on learning levels are striking. So this is data from India, but the same data is essentially very similar patterns you see in many countries. The ones that Kenya, Ghana, Pakistan I've seen, but other countries I think also have similar patterns. Basically, learning levels are extraordinarily low. I mean, one way to measure it, there are 60% of fourth graders and 40% of fifth graders read below second grade level. That's one way to say that. Or if you look at math, 76% of fourth graders and 63% of fifth graders cannot do simple divisions. And this is a fact that you keep finding whenever you look. So it's not a fact that you have to work hard to find. Every survey finds it. When the IGIER, which is this survey in India, which has 700,000 kids, so it's pretty representative, came out, the governments of many of the local governments in India thought these were just lies, so they went and redid the survey, and mostly they found even worse results. So these results are actually real, and they find themselves in many countries. Now, what's the problem? Well, that's what a school looks like. Maybe you think that's a problem. But I think, yeah. So one problem is that one, which is that it could be the lack of inputs, textbooks, you don't have charts, you don't have books, you don't have buildings. Second is sort of shortage of teachers. Third is you teaching somehow the wrong things, or fourth is people just don't want to learn. And fifth is something I'm going to define later, which I'm going to call distorted beliefs, which I'll come back to. I'm going to spend most of the time talking about evidence from randomized controlled trials, but I will actually talk about, whenever relevant, I'll talk about other evidence. I just think that the evidence on randomized controlled trials I know well, and so it's easier for me to describe it. And in any case, I will not do justice to the enormous body of evidence available in education, so I might as well be partial to the things I know. Okay, so first, I think very, very well-established fact. So what I'm going to do, my strategy, I'm going to just I'm going to go through a set of facts relatively without commenting about them. I'm just going to say this is what it is and not say why, and then I'll come back to a why. Okay, so the first fact, inputs. Michael Kramer has a whole, I think, a social laboratory in Western Kenya on the banks of Lake Victoria, where he has carried out a very large number of experiments. Many of these experiments are on inputs, various kinds of inputs, textbooks, charts, school meals, various kinds of inputs. And the basic fact that comes out of that is that these have either zero or very small effects on learning levels. So you can change inputs, you find very little. One fact that is a slight exception to that, which I come back to, is that one thing he does find is that textbooks do matter only for the best performing children in the schools. That's one fact that I hold that fact, because I'll come back to that. On the other hand, and this is that going to school matters. So these two facts are in some ways there's a tension between them, because you think that if going to school matters, then what can I take out of the school before it stops being a school? So how could it be that going to school adds something, but none of the individual inputs matter? So that's sort of a puzzling fact, and I'll come back to what that could possibly mean and why. And very nice evidence of that is from Esther's paper on school expansion in Indonesia, Crispo's paper on compulsory schooling laws in the 60s in Taiwan, when it was a relatively developing country. You see strong effects on learning levels. So it does matter. Learning levels, incomes, all of these things are affected by these outcomes. Here's even, in some sense, more maybe surprising fact. I don't know, maybe, so very little evidence that changing the teacher-student ratio by a very large fraction has any effect. So we did an RCT many years ago, in the mid-90s, in India, where we thought we'll definitely get an effect. We halved the class. Class size went from 40 to 20, not 40, 25 to 14, something like that. Fairly small to even smaller, because there was thought that these are multi-grade classes, you need individual attention to children, so you better collapse the classes. Had no effect on test scores. Attendance went up, so it was not a failed intervention. There was things that went up, but there was no change in pedagogy. We measured pedagogy quite carefully, so there was no change in the way that children got taught, and no change in test scores. We also did another RCT. This one is with Esther in India with Sean Cole, Lee Linden, Esther, and me. We did in India. We did this in 2 cities. Fairly large programs. We're not talking about. So these probably covered several 100,000 people. These programs they were implemented by an NGO, which. The program itself was very successful. I'll come back to the program. But one of the things, it was a pull-out program. The pull-out program means you take half the class and you pull them out and you teach them outside the classroom. So that means the rest of the people who remained there got basically twice the teaching. Basically half the class goes in, so the teacher-student ratio suddenly dropped by 50% and had no effect whatsoever, zero effect on test scores of those people in those classrooms. Similar results actually from, this was like around 2000, around 2 or 3 years ago, Esther, Pascaline Dupa, and Michael Kramer did a very related intervention where, again, there was basically a pull-out element. Classes were divided, and some children were sent to second teachers. and had exactly the same effect. Those who stay with the existing teacher have no gains whatsoever. And that does not mean, and I'll come back to both these programs, that there was no gains from these programs. The programs had effects, but not through the changing in the class size. There were effects through other things. So I want to emphasize that. So these were successful programs which had no effects to class size. Now, one reason why this might be is that maybe the teachers, you can appoint teachers, but you don't get very much for it because teachers don't show up. Though that particular claim is difficult necessarily just to use that to square these facts, because it's not that the second teacher shows up that much more. So there's no reason why, if the first teacher has any effect, since going to school has an effect, if the first teacher has an effect, why doesn't the second one have any? So you might think that this, and you see these absence rates. The absence rates are high. India has 25%, Uganda 27%, Bangladesh, I somehow don't think this number's right, but maybe 16%. But these numbers are, this is teachers, when you show up on a random check, are the teachers there? And the answer is no, they're not often there. So, and basically, if you look at contact time, it's of the order of 50%. So 50% of the time the teacher was supposed to be teaching, he's teaching. Rest of the time, she's drinking tea. Okay. So that's one problem. And you do see some gains from when you fix that. So there's a very nice paper by Esther, Rima Hanna, and Steve Ryan, where what they do is they actually put cameras in classrooms. How do they put cameras in classrooms? They give cameras to the teachers and tell them that if you have to, beginning of the day and end of the day, you have to get yourself, one of the kids, to take the camera and take the picture of you with the rest of the class. And if and there was a date on the film, so you could tell exactly when the picture was taken. So you can basically count the minimum number of hours they were kind of around, and then they gave incentives based on that. So the incentives were basically every day you are supposed to be there, you get about $1 more, slightly over $1 more, and that was quite a significant increase in their stipend. So this and you see absence in these schools. These are NGO-run schools, by the way. This is not the government. This is something much bigger than the government, absence. These schools where the absence dropped from 42% to 21%, which is a huge drop. And you see an increase in test scores. So one piece of the story why they are not learning is that teachers are not teaching. That's almost surely true. And then there's a study by Karthik Muralidharan where he gets contract teachers who have better incentives, who show up more, and you do see effects on test scores again. So you do see effects of this magnitude. The education literature measures the effect on test scores in terms of standard deviations of the underlying distribution of test scores. So how much more do you move up in the existing distribution is the way they measure the impact. I'm going to use this term. Many of the results I'm going to say, I'll come back to the caveat. So he also finds about the same kind of magnitude, actually, gains. So you get some gains. I should say one thing. In the US literature, I learned from Alan many, many years ago that 0.15 standard deviations is considered to be a relatively large effect. So these were bigger than that, but by the development literature, these are small effects. And I'll come back to what they mean in real terms in a little bit. Then pedagogy. So this is where the big gains seem to be. So the remedial education program I mentioned before, which had this pull-out element where you took these kids out of the classroom, if you look at what they did, these were taught by, so what happened was a classroom, you took half the children out, and these were the worst performing children in the classroom. You pull them out and you assign them to somebody who had a high school education, who was paid 1,000 rupees a month. 1,000 rupees in those days was $25. So $25 a month, this is not, even by Indian standards, this is a very low, these are very low paid people who have a high school education. You put them in a classroom and you get gains of about, at the people who are bottom half of the class who got sent to these people, you get gains of the order of magnitudes of 0.6 standard deviation. So that's a much, much bigger gains than what we've seen so far. And we're going to see that pattern. Another one, this one was we did in a different part of India. This is from Jaunpur. I will occasionally move from India, but we have done a bunch of the studies in India, so you'll feel there's an India bias here a little bit, and maybe it's not entirely accidental. So this is in one of the most poorest and most backward parts of India. It's Jaunpur in north-central India. Child attendance was 50%. 15% of children between 7 and 14 could not recognize a letter. 39% could read. So, you know, this is 7 to 14. These are very, very, you know, old children. 14-year-olds who can't read, who've been in school and can't read, that's really striking. So you do, and the randomized experiment was that in 65 of these villages, an NGO called Pratham, whose name will keep coming back because we worked a lot with them, recruited volunteers by going to the village and saying, look, your brothers and sisters can't read. And they showed that basically the test scores, and a bunch of people volunteered to teach these classes. Every village, several volunteers were given a 1 week's training. We're not talking about intensive, you know, re-education of these people. They had a high school degree. They got 1 more week of training, and they were let loose on these children. Okay? Something that would not be allowed by any teachers' union anywhere in the world. What happened? So they conducted evening camp for 2 months. On average, the average child who could not read anything in the baseline who attended camps was 60% more likely to decipher a result. Average child who, just to give some texture, attended a camp and could decipher for letters was 26% more able to read a story. And that means that if you look at, combine this effect with the natural progression of a year, essentially everybody went from not being able to read to able to read letters. And now those who could read letters can now read stories. So they really did manage to get many, many people to read. We're talking about many people here. We're talking about tens of thousands of people, by the way. This is not some boutique experiment which covered 5 people. These are easily tens and thousands of people. And if you measure this in standard deviations, the impact on the people who actually went to these camps is of the order of 1 standard deviation, basically. Another one, this is interesting. This was carried out in Bihar, which is notoriously the most backward part of India. Again with Pratham. Pratham gave special training to government school teachers. This is supposed to be the one group who's like, you know, most, you know, unmotivated, unwilling to. When you give them a training, and then they were asked, will you conduct a summer camp for your children? They were paid some extra for that. They conducted a summer camp for children in the village where they were teaching otherwise. And you see again of 0.2 standard deviations, but that's over only 17% of the population. So if you scale that up by 5, which would be unfair because, you know, many of the children don't need the help, then there would be 1 standard deviation, more than 1 standard deviation. So you get very large gains again. This is with government teachers who are don't have any special motivation or anything. You still get these very large gains. So another way to say it is every average child who attended gained half a level, from nothing to word, word to paragraph, paragraph to story. So they can read halfway towards reading. Half of them could read the next level. So these are very, very large gains by the standard of the education literature, and they seem to be got by people who are not particularly exceptionally gifted. They are, you know, people who have maybe a few years of education, then they get a week's training, and then they can get these gains. So that's sort of a point to flag. On one side, we have all these results of failure, and then we have all these interventions. Similarly, in Kenya, so this is the most bureaucratic version of it. This took a government school and just split up the classroom based on who were performing well in class and divided the class up, so horizontally. So take the top people and put them in one room, and put the people who are doing less well, put them in the other room. Still is taught by essentially the same bureaucratic system of teaching, and you get gains in everywhere in the distribution. This is important. This was not, sometimes it's claimed that when you do this, the kids who are, who are doing well get to now be only with their peers, and they're going to do well, and the people who are doing badly get to be with, weak children, and they're going to do badly. Everybody gained by about 0.2 standard deviations. So even that's a large effect, though this is entirely without changing anything specific in the pedagogy. There's no special training or anything, but that you still get these gains. Finally, this is so one worry we had was that this may be only the kids who are very bottom of the distribution. You can do something different for them, and otherwise you can't affect anything. So this was one intervention where this was also in Bihar, this very backward part of India, where they were given a remedial education. Again, volunteers were trained to help children read, but these were children who could already read. They were helped to help children read more material. But again, it was a week's training. It's the same kind of intervention. Basically, high school or college educated people get a week's training unleashed on a bunch of classrooms, and you see that there are large gains. I think I tried to figure out what it would be in standard deviations. It looks like 0.5 standard deviations or something, but I was doing it very, very rough and ready. But this is very recent results. But it's still the case that even at the top end of the classroom, you can get very large gains through just somebody who's fairly minimal training. So that sort of poses, I think, the fundamental puzzle here. And I'll emphasize why it's even more puzzling in a minute, but it's sort of, you can already see these two facts. One is that people don't learn anything. Second is extraordinarily easy to teach them more. Okay, so that's sort of another one. This is really striking. We did this in early 2000s. It was not actually, it's never been replicated because nobody seems to have been interested. But every pair of children got 2 hours a week to go to a computer terminal, and they played a very simple computer game. This is early 2000s, so the computer games were really silly. These games where you had to solve some math problems, and if you could solve them fast enough, you got to, this is very politically correct game, so you could shoot some garbage into space if you solve these problems. So, but when you do that, you get gains. So these two children together got 2 hours a week of doing this. They just progressed on their own. The math gains, this is just math, and the math gains are about half a standard deviation. Same fact, it's so easy to get gains. Why don't you get gains? That's going to be a refrain of what I have to say. So one possibility is that just somehow these people were acting as motivators, that these teachers were not teaching, they were motivating. That would be one hypothesis. And you do see some evidence of a lack of demand. Let me sort of start with that. So you do see one thing that's striking is that in the same survey I mentioned, children attend is even lower than teacher attendance. So teachers attend, as I said, 75% of the time. When the teacher attends, so the school is open, kids attend 70% of the time. So if you multiply those two together, kids are basically spending half the time in school. So that's clearly part of the answer. But I don't know whether how much of that is a result and how much of that is a cause. Because of course, if the school is completely pointless from your point of view, you're not learning anything, then you may not want to attend. So I don't want to treat that necessarily as independent of the pedagogical and other problems. It's just a symptom in some ways. So another similar fact, which is that 8% of the children, while I described these camps, which had very large gains, but only 8% of the children and 13% of those who could not read attended. Now, these were evening camps, so you have to have some, maybe some interest in it to attend. but to test whether this was because people didn't know about the problem, the NGO actually did a campaign. Over 130 of these villages, they went and actually showed parents their children's performance. So the first result of it is that parents were inclined to beat up their children, but when you prevented that, they still didn't, that was their only reaction. They didn't, for example, when you showed parents these results about the fact that their children were doing very badly or they haven't learned anything, their only reaction was to try to beat up the children sometimes, but otherwise there were really no reactions. They don't complain to the school system, they don't shift children to better schools, they don't seem to do very much about it. This is in Pakistan, there was a very nice randomized experiment done by Jishnu Das, Asim Khwaja, and someone else. Tristan somebody. Where they give every school, every parent a report card about the school. So they show that this school is not performing, other schools in the district are performing. You don't see any movement out of the school. You do see prices falling, so the bad schools reduce their fees, but that's all that changes. You don't see any change in the allocation. There's also other, I think, very interesting evidence of direct evidence on demand effects. There's a nice paper by Foster and Rosenzweig who look at, this is not an experiment, they look at areas in India which were suitable for high-yielding varieties of grains, and under the theory that when you have new technologies, education is more important, and they look at places which were geographically suited for the currently available new technology and look at what happens to education, and they find a substantial effect on people's school attendance. So there's maybe, again, when education is more valued, maybe people do want it more. This is a nice experiment. Kramer, Miguel, and Thornton gave $20 for the top 15 performers in a classroom in a random set of schools in Kenya. And you do see effects on this. The scholarship was just given to the girls, but you see that the girls gain, but surprisingly, the boys who were excluded from this scholarship also gain. The boys actually gain about half what the girls gain, suggesting that what's happening is that when you give incentives to girls who can get, so they can get money if they do well, they put pressure on the teacher to work harder. They find some direct effect on that, and that then spills over on the boys. So you see an effect even on the directly non-beneficiary boys. You see that, and you see that the girls who were unlikely to win the prize, who were at the bottom of the class, also gain because the teachers just put in more effort. So that there is some effect that demand is lower than it should be. Finally, there's some direct effects. So Rob Jensen has a very nice paper where he looks at what happens when a call center opens near your village. His experiment, that's not true. Emily Oster has an experiment where she looks at what happens when call center opens near your village. She finds large effects on school attendance. Rob Jensen has a nice experiment where he actually goes to certain parents and tells them, look, there are jobs in call centers. These are good jobs. Your girl can get it. And you see effects on not only on girl school attendance, but also even on their health. You see a wide range of effects on human capital outcomes. Rob also did an experiment in Dominican Republic where he actually went to villages and announced the return to education, literally, 8% or something. He just said, it's sort of, now, my guess would have been that would have no effect. What does 8% mean? But in fact, when you say that, you get fairly large gains in school attendance. Finally, Trang Nguyen did an experiment in Madagascar, similar, where she also goes and tells people the return to education. She also tells them about, who gets this education. So is it like some elite person gets these gains or somebody like you gets this gain? So she tries to decompose that. Again, you've seen very large effects. So these are very, very large effects. Overall, 0.2 standard deviation test scores, 0.4 standard deviation. Some of the parents who, before she did that, she surveyed all the parents and asked them, what do you think is the return to education? So the ones who think, for my child, no returns or something like that, for those people, you see a 0.4 standard deviation gain, which is huge. Just by telling them, this is like for free, basically. You tell them that the returns to education are high, even for your children, and then you see big gains. There's another experiment by Jim Berry who gives a little bonus, but basically demand effects, I think, are strong and important. It's clear that that's part of the story. But is it all demand? So that goes back to now, let's go back to what I said. There is maybe, so far, we could explain all the facts by saying, yes, all these things are there, but you just lack motivation. Now, one thing that's puzzling about this is that one way to look at it is look at children who go to private schools. This is demand-driven. Now, all over the developing world, there are these private schools which you wouldn't recognize. Private schools where the fees are of the order of, $10 per month. Indeed, I went to a private school where the fees were always $5 a month. But these are in old days, maybe things were cheaper then, but these are not, it's very common to have lots and lots of private schools. In India now, about 17% of the children go to private school. And that's a fast-growing part of the economy, so there is something going on. There is some sort of realignment. People are looking for other options for the children. Now, problem is that there isn't a good RCT which looks at private school, effect of private schooling on educational outcomes. So what you have to do is you have to try to make some observational study where you try to control for observables. You're probably underestimating the effect from that, overestimating the effect from that. Why? Because you're controlling for observables, but even within the same family, some kids go to private school and others don't, and that probably has something to do with either their motivation or what their parents do for them or other investments in these kids. So it's hard to imagine that if you just compare kids who go to private school with kids who don't, you will get the true effect. You're getting an overestimate of the effect. Let's look at the effect. The effect is about, when you do this, you get much smaller effects than what you get from these essentially NGO-run, more or less extremely cheap interventions into pedagogy. So the private school effects, which are sort of, if you like, these are people selecting in, they want education. The private schools have incentives to provide better education. They're very competitive sectors. There are, I think Jishnu Das describes in Punjab, in Pakistan, there are 8 schools available to every child in a village. So 8 private schools. No, 6 private schools and 2 government schools. I think that, so very competitive, yet you see that even in that competitive sector, it doesn't deliver anything like the numbers we saw before. The computer-assisted learning generated 0.47 standard deviation. This generates 0.22. I am playing a little bit on a dangerous margin here. You might say that, what is the underlying standard deviation? Maybe there varies across these places. But actually, many of these studies are done exactly in the same environment. So these comparisons are actually valid. So for example, this result is from exactly the same NGO that was doing the interventions, collected this data, which is used. So the underlying standard deviation is exactly the same. So you don't have to worry about that. Same test. So exactly the same tests, everything's the same here. So this is exactly comparable, and you get twice or thrice as large results easily. So what's going on? Why isn't the market delivering what this NGO and many NGOs and many other interventions seem to be able to generate? Why isn't the private market generating? So that's sort of the question. And so here's the hypothesis. So the hypothesis is that this shared pedagogy, which is shared across all schools, is basically fundamentally inappropriate. It's inappropriate in a very specific way. It's covered based on covering material rather than giving every child the opportunity to learn. in fact, now in India, there's a law which says that every school has to teach this many pages every year. It's inscribed into the national law. So now you cannot ever, you're supposed to go to jail if you don't cover 250 pages of geography in 4th grade. Okay? So this, I think, is related to the idea that education is essentially result of an idea that the whole system sees education as a gamble, as something where most of us will not get anything out of it, but some of us will get the jackpot. The jackpot is get a government job. When you ask people in many countries, what's their goal for their children, ask poor people, they'll say 80% in India say they want a government job. And so the goal for these people is somehow to get through an exam and get a government job. So they think that all the gains to education are at the top end. But if you're in 1st grade, your probability of getting there is so diffuse that essentially the effective gain for an extra year of investment is basically linear at that point. And to the extent that anybody's looked at the gains for education, they seem pretty linear. So everybody's theory is very nonlinear. Once I get to this jump, I'm going to get, but when you're in 4th grade, you don't know whether you're going to get there. So there's a lot of uncertainty, which basically makes it pretty linear when you go from 4th to 5th grade. You get about the same gains as you get from 3rd to 4th grade. It's not that there's a big difference there. That's what you find. So if now under this hypothesis, people basically say, okay, let's try to give it a shot. We'll send our children to school. If it turns out that they're really smart and they're going to do well, then great. Otherwise, there's no point putting effort into it because they're never going to get to this jackpot. So teachers also take the same view. Teachers teach to the top of the class because parents want them to teach to the top of the class. And if in one of Esther's experiments in Kenya, they divided up the class, as I said, and gave to put the top children in one room and the bottom children in a different room. And the immediate effect of that was that the teachers who were supposed to teach the bottom section complained that they have failed and they have been assigned all these bad children. They don't want to teach them. So everybody assumes that the goal of teaching is to teach these top children and get them to get some jackpot, and the rest of it is irrelevant. And now, as I said, all the evidence suggests they're probably wrong. Now, I think this can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if kids assume that, so basically when you enter school, you're all the same, let's say. In day one, you're not paying attention. In the meanwhile, they teach you ABC. Next day, you're going to DEF, but you missed ABC. Then you don't quite understand DEF, and then you're lost. And basically, at that point, if you've fallen behind, the presumption of the whole system is that you're stupid. And nobody bothers to help them catch up. They start believing that they're stupid and give up, which reinforces everybody's belief. Because everybody thinks, yes, this kid is stupid, therefore we shouldn't bother to invest in him, but then, of course, they remain stupid. So there's lots of facts fit with this. I'm going to say these facts and stop. So one thing is that parents really discriminate among children. One striking thing is, I don't think you'll ever notice this in Italy, but like you go to a family and you talk to them about the children's education, ask them, are your children going to school? And say, oh yeah, she's really smart. And they often say she, it's striking. She's really smart, she's going to private school. And these guys are all idiots. Sorry, forgive me. I just wanted to get the gender dimension right. And you were, but there's a sense in which they say this in front of the children. The children are all looking there, and they kind of agree, yes, she's smart, we're stupid. I mean, I've had so many people say it, I feel so bad. An 80-year-old saying, I'm stupid, that's to me, tragedy. And you see that, so parents in Madagascar say that those 70% of those who complete schooling will get a government job. In fact, the probability is less than half. But on average, the returns they save on education are actually right. So basically, they're putting much too low weight at the bottom of the distribution and much too high weight on the top end of the distribution. So that sort of fits what I was saying. It also explains why returns to remedial education are so high. Why? Because remedial education is all about training the teachers to pay attention to these kids who are behind. So it's very easy to teach them. They haven't learned anything, but they're not stupid. They're just You try and you can teach them, so that's not surprising. Why tracking works? Why does cutting the class in half help even the classes, the people at the bottom? Well, even the classes, the people at the bottom are now, the teacher is forced to teach to the top of their group, not the top of the other higher group. When you class the top class, cut the class in half, you get the, teacher was teaching to the first percentile, now the teacher is teaching to the 50th percentile. And that's still much closer to the 10th percentile than he would have been, and therefore you get gains. Why do government teachers perform so differently in summer schools? Because the government schools are now told, in school they're told you have to, your job is to teach to the whole syllabus. You have to cover history even if these kids in class can't read. In summer school they're told your job is to teach these children reading, and then they can teach reading. It's not just a matter of incentives. Even these teachers get very large gains. Why being in school generates learning? Why textbooks only work for best students? Well, textbooks are written for best students, there's no surprise. Why does being in school generate learning but not teacher-student ratio? Well, the teacher's teaching to the top 3 people. It doesn't matter what the teacher-student ratio is, because the bottom of the class is ignored in any case. You change the teacher-student ratio, you still have the top 3 people, so it doesn't change very much. And why private schools don't do much better? Because they're not intended to do much better. Private schools are supposed to do exactly the same thing as all other schools, which is teach to the top of the class. And therefore, they don't do much better because that's not the plan. So everybody believes in this lottery. OK, so I can go on, but so basically, in summary, I was going to have a couple more slides on what to do, but I don't think that's so relevant in this context, and I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to, so basically, what I want to leave you with is the thought that maybe there is actually, in some sense, way we think about education as a sort of policy area has always been polarized between people who say, oh, we have to build schools. We have to bring schools closer to people, and people who say that, we have to, there's no point building schools because there's no incentive to learn because, labor markets are screwed up. In fact, I think a big piece of the missing story is actually neither of these, but an entirely different hypothesis, which is that, in fact, nobody's trying to teach, therefore people are not learning. And I think if we actually if you decided that the school system should try to teach the average person, then I think they would have very different performance. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Abhijit. Hi. Some of the things that you were saying about self-fulfilling, feeling stupid and self-fulfilling and all that, remind me a little bit of some of the work of some sociologists like Jim Coleman or Akerlof and Cranton about identity in American schools, like if this accepted norm in some American school that you are cool if you don't learn anything, then everybody doesn't want to learn anything because it's cool to learn anything. And the implication of that literature seems to be that if you can throw as much money you want in those schools and nothing is going to happen if you don't change the culture in the school. Is there a sort of a connection with this? I mean, is that something that you are thinking about? Or
yeah, so it's, I think, even closer to the stereotype threat literature, where you tell people that you are black, you started underperforming. There's these nice experiments. It's closer to that. I think that what is definitely true is that, so there's a very nice experiment where teachers from different castes, Indian society is divided in castes, high castes are supposed to be elite, low castes are supposed to be non-elite. So teachers for different castes were randomly chosen to evaluate the same paper. So same paper was given to 2 teachers, and some of those had the caste of the child, his caste name marked on it, some of didn't. This is by Rima Hanna, Lee Linden, Sandil Mulayathan, and Marianne Bertrand. If I get that, there's too many people, so it's hard for me to keep track of them, but, sorry? Okay, Rima and Lee. I think they were originally 4 people, but I think then 2 dropped out. So what they find is when you do that, who do you think, what happens? So they started with the hypothesis that you see discrimination. You see the high caste people grading the low caste students badly. The same paper is being graded by two people from different castes. In fact, they found the opposite. They found the low caste teachers grade low caste students badly, unfairly badly. The high caste don't discriminate. It seems like what they have internalized the idea that if you're low caste, you cannot be good. And so they are the ones who seem to discriminate. So it's much more like the stereotype threat literature than I think more this literature that you mentioned. But there's a fundamental sociology of it is very important because it is related to, many of these new learners are from these backgrounds which make them much more likely to accept the hypothesis that they're stupid. So it works very much like that. So if you already start by thinking people from my caste are stupid, then if teacher keeps saying that you're stupid, then it's easier for you to believe that.
Okay, so one piece that I didn't see in this, and maybe there is not anything from India which you presented mostly, is what do teachers know? So are teachers knowledgeable enough to teach these kids? So there is a recent study done by a bunch of researchers from Oxford and Jacob Svensson, where they test the teachers with the test that the kids are supposed to take. And they find that a bunch of these teachers, a large portion of the teachers, they actually don't pass the test in primary school. So given that you have the universal primary education reforms in a lot of African countries, I presume that you had to have very rapid recruitment processes, and that this problem might be another reason why kids are in school, but they're not learning because teachers are not able to teach them.
So you're almost surely right that the quality of teacher matters. Mostly that these teachers, however, are the successful products of the same education system that produced these other people who are volunteers, who are less successful than the teachers. Being a teacher is everybody's life goal in this population. So if you think of the people who are doing the sort of these interventions as volunteers, they are inferior products of the same education system that produces the teachers. So it's hard for me to imagine. It's completely, almost surely true that the teacher quality is low, but the gains are available for even lower people who put in the effort. That's the main point I wanted to make here. This is not to disagree with the fact that the teaching quality is low. It's to make the point that even within that framework, large gains are available because the people who are doing the volunteering are villagers who are high school students who are trying to be teachers in their life.
But those teachers that you were showing in the results, they were trained as well. So you're sure that they have this basic 1 week training, whatever, and they have a college degree. So what do we really know about teachers in the primary schools?
We know that the teachers in the primary school, being a primary school, the people who are in college, for them the life goal is to be a primary school teacher, and most of them will not make it. So we know very well that these are people who are at the end of the pipeline they want to be in.
A short one. This idea that you mentioned that parents seems to regard their children attending school as a jackpot. Now, I was wondering how rational this is, in a sense that, I mean, you can imagine that within a culture in which merit doesn't really matter, just whether, connections and networks that gives you a job in the government, maybe that's rational to have this idea. And if that is so, then it might be very difficult for intervention to change it. So I was wondering whether, there is some evidence that suggests, for example, that in different places where maybe the culture is different, or maybe it's rational to have a different attitude to what gets you to that job, things may be different or not.
So so at some level, I think that if you think of that's what I'm trying to say, somebody who's in 3rd grade, his probability of getting a government job is still extraordinarily small. I mean, the difference in probability of some 2 villagers' children. And so most of the gains come from some other element in the distribution. The gains, returns to education, look pretty much like in any other country in India, a little higher, but not that much higher. But it's not, those gains are not coming from getting the teacher. The measured gains come from something else.
That's why I'm saying, you sort of said it in passing, but I think that's the answer to the question, is that when you look at it year by year by year, they appear to be log linear like they are in the US pretty much. I mean, there is some little sheepskin effect, but there is not huge, tremendous amount of convexity, even when you just look at it in the OLS, where you should have this big selection effect. So first order, it seems that one more year of education makes you a bit more productive somehow, maybe in your business or in your farm. So the reality seems to be somewhat discordant to the belief that people have, which are that the returns are very low at the beginning and then improve much.
So three very quick things. One is just related to that. I mean, in the Madagascar context, for example, you said 70% of the parents believe that the children can get good government jobs. So that makes it sound, I mean, again, in India probably it's less, but it makes it sound like it's not a very long odds gamble. So,
oh no, 70% think, but it's not true.
But it's what matters is what the parents think.
Oh, absolutely. So I wouldn't disagree with the fact that the part of the distortion comes from I had a slide, one of our early slides was distorted beliefs. So I completely think the beliefs are distorted, and that's driving the whole system. Yeah. So I wouldn't disagree with that. I just think that those beliefs are not based in, we shouldn't assume that the beliefs are based in reality. Then I'm fine with it.
But again, I think for your story, it's just the only point I wanted to make. I think your story works much better if this is really long odds. And I don't know whether it's really long odds in the beliefs that, but
it's extremely long odds. If you are a third grader, your probability of getting a government job, this is conditional on getting through the high school. What is the probability you get a government job? That's 33%. Yes. Probability that a third grader will complete high school is about 10%. So we're talking 3% now. So it's extremely low odds.
Okay. So another kind of theory that might work, I don't know, is that many of these things are actually complementary. So that textbooks without motivated teachers won't work, and it seems like a few of the patterns, I'm not sure whether all of the patterns, because you listed many, would be sort of consistent with this kind of complementary inputs story, and it's very important to get the teachers motivated. And if you just put more money without motivating the teachers, it's not going to work, but if you put the teachers motivated, that might work. And then my final question is whether, in doing these things, people worry about temporary Hawthorne effects, especially when you are treating these, when the treatment is dealing with the teachers, that you put the teacher, these are unmotivated teachers, you put them in a new environment, they temporarily start moving a little faster. In a month's time, they're going to be back, so a lot of it might be illusory.
Okay, so I think the answer is no, I think is a short answer, that I don't think that that's what's going on. I don't think that it's a Hawthorne effect, to start with. It's not the case that, so let me start with the last question. It's not, because many of these interventions last a year, including some of these interventions are just kids playing on computers, which presumably are not subject to Hawthorne effect. But I think even these volunteer teachers, these things last quite a long time. It's hard to imagine that your excitement on being a new teacher will go for a year, for example. One of these interventions we studied over 3 years, so it's unlikely to be that. Second, I think the complementarity is completely right. It almost surely is there, but almost surely is, that says that the effects of these interventions is underestimated, because basically these people who are going and teaching, this first intervention, which is 10th grader going and teaching in schools, we studied that over 3 years. They were always there. And this is stuff that almost surely, if there were, if you actually had other inputs that would have gained more, we are underestimating the gain. So but the complementarity isn't explaining this fact, because this is just somebody who's taking kids out of the system with almost no change in inputs. We had another question. Okay.
Abhijit, I thought that was really fascinating, and the idea of the lotteries is interesting, especially since I firmly believe the return to schooling is log linear. I'm a bit surprised if you just tell people that there's a return to schooling and at 8% they respond to that.
I was surprised too, but I don't know. It seems to be true.
There was an experiment in the US which was much stronger intervention in a way. MDRC did this evaluation, career academies, where they took kids who were not planning to go to college and they had them working in companies, and what the kids discovered was that the college graduates did a lot better, so they were more likely to go to college. But there they kind of saw firsthand that there was a payoff, so I was still surprised by what you said. Could you summarize your results? Would you say you can interpret all your findings as time on task matters? If kids are devoting time to learning a task, that matters and has educational effects. But the incentives for time on task distorted.
Yeah.
Because it seems to me that
that's a perfectly good summary of everything I said. Yeah.
One thing that surprised me about the...
I could have, you know. You could have skipped the last hour. I should have just asked you.
No, because I think time on task matters. I mean, fundamentally, I think that's kind of why years of schooling matters. And it is why I think class size matters, because I think if you have a smaller class, the kids spend more time on task. Well, it did in some of your studies. It did in Kenya when you sorted them.
No.
But you don't know if it was the sorting.
I tried to say,
sorted.
I tried to say that at the beginning, but
okay.
I didn't say it.
That's why I think class size matters in the U.S. But one last comment. If you just randomly divided the class in half, you're less likely to have a star in your class. So even in your model, I would think the random class size reduction should matter. Now maybe it wouldn't have enough
but
power
much
to pick it
smaller.
up.
I think this is your study. You didn't find anything when you randomly. You find a small gain, I think.
No. But in your view of why the sorting mattered, you end up with some sorting just because of the law of large numbers.
But as long as there are two people at the top, the teacher just focuses the eyes on them. You see their body language is that they're looking at those two kids, and that's it. I've seen them so many times just looking at like two kids and never even looking at the faces of anybody else. So I
likely to have those two.
True, but you find two, yeah. No, I think Alan's point is right. Yeah, the best could be closer to you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we have 2 minutes remaining. I propose Fulvio and Katja to ask the question, and Abhijit either randomizes or combines the answers to both. Okay?
Yeah, coming back to the theme of the lottery, right? I was wondering how much that depends from institutional details and how can that be different in different countries. I was thinking about China. I have the feeling that in China, education is not taken as a lottery, and people do believe that you get something out of education. It might go back to Confucianism, the fact that you have to take an exam and you have to study for an exam to become a bureaucrat, and that might be an institutional effect. Is there any study that relates to China? Is there any comparison to China that could be possibly interesting?
Okay, it's a hard question. So I may randomize it in one direction.
I have another quick comment concerning your point on giving information about returns. You showed us quite some evidence that about programs that increased attendance but didn't have effect on test scores. So in this sense, I think there can be instances where parents expecting low returns can actually be rational. And so I think it's quite important, first of all, to see in the context if people have, if students and parents have a good idea about the returns they can have or not. And then depending on the context, you can kind of inform them. Even though I think, you know, saying as a researcher predicting for an individual student what would be the return is actually not so easy, because the parents might have actually better knowledge about the kid than the researcher. So I think it depends quite a bit on the context. So for example, in Mexico, we found that kind of older students had pretty good idea about the returns they could have, and there this would probably not be a good policy, while in the case of Rob Jensen, this would obviously be kind of a very cost-effective policy of just giving this information and then increasing attendance.
So I think that both of you, I think the context is important. I wouldn't disagree. I think that I want to say only one thing about that, which is that I think that in general, I suspect older children you'll find all the effects when you give information come mostly pure information come from younger children. But if you look at the Rob Jensen study and Emily Oster's study about what happens when you actually tell people about call centers, those are for actually, so I think it's still true that there's lots of missing information. I think that you're right that there's a lot more information. If you're in 10th grade, you know a lot more about than if you're a parent of a 10th grader, you've already gone through, you learned a lot about the system. If you're a parent of a 3rd grader, you know a lot less. But still, there's lots of missing information because those were studies for actually 11th graders. And there you do see big effects. And these are people who are clearly gone way into the education system who have, so I think the context does matter, but I do think that there is still lots of missing information.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.